everyone! So today I'm going to be going through my top 10 books of the decade. Quick note, I won't be making any kind of top list of the year because most of the books I've read this year did not come out this year. It's just the way it works. So for this list I gave myself a few self-imposed rules, the first one being, of course, the books had to have been published in 2010 or later. But I also decided that if a book was part of a series, I wanted the book series to have started within this last decade. I know it might seem like a slightly odd restriction, but I felt at the time that it made the most sense as some of my favorite series have been running since the 90s or early 2000s and have released books this decade, but it feels like slightly a bit of a cop-out. So I also tried to make sure I didn't pick more than one book per author, since I have some authors who have released a lot of books in the past decade that I've really enjoyed. And I wanted the list to be at least slightly diverse. Lastly, all of the books have to be fiction. I am well aware that there have been a multitude of amazing nonfiction and poetry within the last decade, but that's just not what this list is about, and so it's fiction only. Also, just a quick reminder that this is my personal list of favorite books and/or the books that have really stuck with me throughout the entire decade. This is absolutely not a list of the most impactful or most popular books of the decade. This is just a list of my personal favorites. So, coming in at number 10 is Paul Hoffman's The Left Hand of God. I read this book actually right when it came out in 2010, and admittedly I haven't read it since, I don't think. And I don't remember too much about it. Why it is on this list is because every time I think about it, I have such positive and fond feelings about it that I remember bits and pieces very vividly, but at the end of the day I know that this book impacted me at the time, and it still feels like it impacts me even if I remember less about it than I do about some of the other books on this list. And even just thinking about it, I'm like, oh man, I need to grab the other books and reread the whole series now, so that's a thing I'm probably gonna do fairly soon. So number 9 on this list is David McInnes Gill's Black Hole Sun. Oh, I love the shiny cover. It is a sci-fi book that was published in 2010, and I remember loving it because it just threw me into the world and expected me to figure out what was going on and just to catch up to the story. And when I read the book in 2010, I remember I hadn't read tons of books that just really just threw me into the story, so I thought it was interesting. As someone who grew up with a lot of sci-fi, I was exposed very early to different sci-fi books and movies. Black Hole Sun hits a lot of the things that I want to see in more modern sci-fi now, and I remember it had a major impact on how I read sci-fi when I was younger, and still trying to figure out what I really like in books and what I don't like. Book number 8 is Held by Edith Ravel. It was published in 2011. I remember picking this book up in the library, sitting down with it in a chair, reading about halfway through, and then being told, nope, time to go home. And so I, got the book out of the library, went home, finished it in a sitting, which I mean, it's not very long, but, finished it in one sitting, and immediately, the next day, we took the book back to the library, and then I went out and bought a copy so that I always had a copy to reread. The book tells the story of a girl who gets kidnapped and develops Stockholm Syndrome while her captor actually develops Lima Syndrome, which is, the captor falling or empathizing with the captive. From there they have a romance, so to speak, and without spoiling the ending, it's riveting and really provokes a lot of thought about what really happened, especially with what is quite an unreliable narrator. For, I think, obvious reasons she is unreliable, but it is very interesting. I had a lot of very strong emotions reading it, which is something that I think is not necessarily always good depending on how an author gets those emotions out of you, but I think in this case it was very well done. It is honestly, it's the shortest book on this list, I think, but the impact was very, very big. So number 7 goes to The Girl in 6E by Alessandra Tor, published in 2013. Sorry, I can't get over how good the cover is. So I have so much love for this book, and I have a lot to say about certain aspects of it that should be actually saved for a later video. It's about a girl who is scared she's going to kill people if she's around them, so she locks herself up in her room. It's very, very oversimplified, but that's essentially it. She puts on like sexual cam shows to make money and then gets all her food and everything else she needs delivered straight to her apartment door. Eventually, out of worry for a small girl, she leaves the apartment and with the help of the delivery man goes on a journey to save the girl. It's suspenseful, there's a little bit of romance actually, which was an interesting choice that I actually personally liked. And honestly, it kept me thinking about this book for such a long time, and I think it's just really great. Coming in at number 6 is Once Burned by Jeaniene Frost. Haha. There we go. We'll hold it up in the light. I love Jeaniene Frost's work ever since I discovered her Night Huntress series in a used bookstore. This book, Once Burned, was published in 2012 and actually follows, as one of the main characters, a minor character from the Night Huntress series. Vlad the Impaler is a vampire and falls in love with a woman with weird and powerful supernatural abilities. Honestly, it's probably actually my favorite work of Frost's so far. The characters are fun and realistic within the world of vampire romance fiction that Frost has created, and I think it's just very well done. It has a soft spot in my heart and I really like it, and I still reread it quite often. So it goes on this list. So number 5 is the book Sometimes We Tell the Truth by Kim Zarins, published in 2016. This book has made me cry on 3 separate occasions within the book, and I still get teary-eyed every time I reread it. The book was written for teens, I think younger teens, but still teens, and is a modern retelling of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The teens are basically on a bus on a school trip, and in order to keep them all in line, the teacher has them each tell a story. The person who tells the best story wins. The woman who wrote this book was attempting to bring the Canterbury Tales to a younger audience by making a lot of the language more accessible and a lot of the stories more accessible. So one of the stories, it's, you know, zombie brothers in an apocalypse. Another one is Harry Potter fan fiction. It's very accessible, which it has to be for it to be a teen book, but it makes something like Canterbury Tales, which can feel very inaccessible to some people, feel more accessible, and you're getting the story. She also wrote in the character of Geoffrey, who has his own story and own sort of life to figure out, and so in part, Sometimes We Tell the Truth becomes his coming of age story as he grapples with his sexuality and his feelings for his friend, and also the way his friend looks at his own sexuality. And from there, it becomes actually still quite a heartwarming tale of figuring out who you are and what you're capable of. It's an enchanting read, and everybody needs to check out Sometimes We Tell the Truth. Number 4 goes to Sherilyn Kenyon's Dead Men Walking, which has a shiny cover. Look at that. I adore Sherilyn Kenyon's work in general. I think a lot of her books, they're just brilliant, and even the ones I'm less into, I still think they're pretty decent, which is, I think, a really good thing for an author to be. She's just good, and then a lot of her books are amazing. Dead Men Walking, very, very good. This is one of the most standout books to me that she's ever written. Part of it is my own love of nautical and pirate-themed media. As much as Dead Men Walking isn't actually as much about pirates as you'd think, it's more about supernatural beings back from the dead on a ship to fight evil things also at the sea. It very much feels piratey, even if they aren't actually pirates. Like most of Sherilyn Kenyon's other work, it is a romance novel, but also has like a huge, intricate plot to it with lots of other things happening, and especially in this book, the romance almost feels slightly more sidelined than a lot of her other books. I find I don't mind it too much, because the romance was really good and still kept me really cheering for the characters while still being very invested in everything else that's happening. The actual sort of action plot does also kind of revolve around the romance, so it makes certain things flow together quite well. I first read this book road tripping from Florida back up to where I live in Canada, and other than like, you know, stopping for food, and then sometimes it was my turn to drive. I like read it, and like no one could tear me away from the book if it wasn't very, very important. So yeah, this has absolutely been a standout book for me of the decade. So book number 3 on this list goes to The Last Stormlord by Glenda Lark. I adore this series. This book, like, I don't know if you can see how many like wear lines are in this, but this book really helped me at a time when I didn't feel like a lot of help was possible. It was there, it kept me busy, it kept my mind engaged, and I really like it. It's a really interesting fantasy story. The world building is really, really cool. The magic system is interesting. A lot of it involves water and making storms, and it's great. You should read it. There's a lot to it, so I don't really know how to go over what happens in it, but it's very, very good. Number 2 goes to Katharina Vermette's The Break. This is actually a book I read for one of my CanLit classes, and I have a lot of opinions about some of the other stuff you would read for a Canadian literature class, which is why I was so incredibly overwhelmed and shocked when we read The Break. This book tells the story of a family dealing with the fallout of a very shocking crime. I think actually the best way to describe this book without going into it too much is just to read not the blurb on the back, but just the little bold print on the back. Set in a community of mixed Indigenous and settler descent, The Break tells the story of a multi-generational family dealing with the fallout of a shocking crime. There's so much more to it than that, but honestly, that sums it up really, really well. It's a great book. Everybody should read it. I was lucky enough to see Katharina Vermette speak at my university last year, and I was lucky enough to get her to sign my book, and I got to speak with her for a few moments, and she's done a wonderful job. She's a wonderful author. You should read this book. You should also read her poetry. All of it's really good. Yeah. And coming in at number 1 for my top 10 books of the decade list is Rachel Aaron's The Legend of Eli Mompress. Anyone who has ever heard me talk about this will not be surprised. This is my favorite book, probably one of my favorite books of all time. Forget top of the decade. All time. When I sat down to do this list, some of the places and books on this list I had a bit of a harder time with. This one, I knew it was going in the number 1 spot the moment I thought, I should do one of these lists. And yeah, I don't think anything could beat out this book, honestly. I'm just very, very into The Legend of Eli Mompress, so. It's about a very charming thief who just wants to see his bounty get bigger. And that there's more to it. There's so much more. There's more books in the series, but it is just priceless to read. The first book in The Legend of Eli Mompress actually came out in 2010. It was called The Spirit Thief, and basically the first 3 books ended up in this big volume called The Legend of Eli Mompress. But it still counts as top book of the decade, so it's a great fantasy story with really great world building and a really interesting magic system that involves spirits being in everything, water and wind and all this stuff, and then people that can not only see and talk to the spirits but then harness them into helping them do certain things, and then that becomes the magic of the series. And it's great. So, Legend of Eli Mompress. And that concludes my top 10 books of the decade list. I'm really excited to have gotten to share this with you, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm really curious what people think of my list, if you agree or disagree, and what were your top 10 books of the decade? I'm very curious, and let me know what your top 10 books of 2019 are, because that's not a video that's coming, but I'm still curious. Yeah, comment, let me know. See you in the next video. Bye!